Good morning. My name is Emmanuel Wachendo, Program Officer here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, International Trade and Development Program. Together with my colleague Moses Mushiri Mwangi, we are presenting on WTO, the World Trade Organization reforms, what we think a country like Kenya should pursue. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank. We specialize in validating or invalidating public policy uh, in the interest of the public. Our vision is a Kenya that is flourishing, and as such, our mission is to track and make proposals on what we think are the policy ideas that would contribute to a prosperous. So today's presentation is about the World Trade Organization. We find ourselves in a moment that is equal parts precarious and promising in that sometimes during a shakeup, there's opportunity for real exploration of new ideas, different directions. And in this case, when we find that the world trading system is itself facing serious challenges, we thought it good and proper to explore what ideas we think should be priority reforms. Uh, so today's presentation will take you through a background of what trade looks like since the World Trade Organization was formed, how the World Trade Organization has contributed to trade and welfare in the world, look at what Kenya's position is in world trade, and then explore what some of the major countries have been trying to push forward as ideas for reform, and then give our perspective on what areas we think the World Trade Organization should reform and what reform ideas a country like Kenya should pursue. So, a quick background. The world, uh, the trading order looks the way it is. It was shaped in the post-war, in the post-Second World War era. What happened was that after the Second World War, the world um, sort of came to a consensus that one of the causes, one of the contributing causes to the global conflicts was tariffs, right? Protectionism, the the absence of free trade. And so major countries got together and and set out some institutions, establish some institutions, and try to set out rules and negotiate rules on how countries would trade. So that began with the GATS, the Global Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. And what followed then was as the world started to lower the barriers to trade, right? Tariff and non tariff barriers, then we started to see a rise in global welfare. So these are some of the major events that followed the establishment of the new World Trade Order. We had the rise of Japan and the trade war. Now, in the 1980s, Japan had already gone through almost 30 years of 10% annual economic growth. Its economy had already grown at a rate of 10% per year, just about consistently for about a generation. And in that period, the structure of its economy had transformed and it had become very competitive in global trade. And one of its most important markets for one of its most important products, a motor vehicle, was the United States. Now, Japan was so competitive, its car companies were producing such efficient, fuel efficient vehicles in a period where oil prices were rising. And not only were their cars very fuel efficient, but they were cheaper than what the big three of the United States were producing, right? GM, Ford, and whichever the third company is, it doesn't come to mind at the moment. But the United States and Japan went through sort of a trade spat, and one of the issues was, politically speaking, right? The political discourse was such that, okay, Japan is exporting too many cars to the United States, and it's displacing American automobile manufacturers. So the two countries had to come to a new agreement, and Japan's export of vehicles and other major issues were resolved by changing the rules. In the 1990s, by the year 1996, the World Trade Organization was formed, and we finally arrived at a globalized rule-based system, right? And in that period, trade barriers continued to fall. In the 2000s, China and India joined the World Trade Organization. China, especially, was a very important market. China sought more access to global markets, and many of the world's most advanced economies also sought access to Chinese markets. So that was the major event of the 2000s, and in the 2010s saw the rise of a multitude of regional blocs. This was also part of allowances granted by the World Trade Organization on the supply side, but also on the demand side, countries also sought to open up their borders to their neighbors and give some sort of preferential treatment to their neighbors. By the year 2025, we arrived at the period. We find ourselves in a period where global discourse on trade has changed from a consensus on free trade to nationalistic concerns, right? What economists might call a mercantilist bent to the debate. So all the year 2025 and the period leading up to 2025 saw an unprecedented escalation in what economists might call trade wars, right? Or, sorry, what political scientists might call trade wars, and what economists might be. So, for economists, war and trade it's a metaphor that's not quite fitting. Now, here we have an apology from Neil Gorsuch. I think that's how his name is pronounced. He'll have to pardon me. We all have difficulties pronouncing each other's names. Now, this missive was offered after the United States Supreme Court struck down the tariffs that have been put up by the administration of the day, the American administration of the day. And the opinion they had on these tariffs was that they were unconstitutional and that they should actually be approved by Congress. And so what we have here within the United States is a conversation about the rules and following the rules in making policy, in making trade policy. Moses?
Thanks, Emmanuel. So, as Emmanuel has pointed out, that the world at some point realized there is need for them to collaborate in ensuring that trade happen within some set of rules. And therefore, we are going to check, since these rules were adopted, how has trade behaved? And as we can see on the screen, since WTO came into effect, and WTO here means World Trade Organization, it's the leading body that ensures that trading in goods and services is both predictable, and then there's harmonization, and also there is dispute resolution when dispute occurs amongst countries. So how has trade happened? It's good to note that, and this is important, and especially for Kenyans and also policymakers in this country, that as of 2024, of all goods in the world, 28% of the value in it was added by a different country. What that tells you is all countries globally depend on a different country, at least to 30% of the value they consume from these goods. Why is this important? This is important because it tells you, one, that there is a need for interdependency among nations in the world. And also it tells you that there's no country that can, at any point, be able to produce everything it needs. And that's not a bad sign. It only means that countries can be able to produce what they can best produce for themselves and for the world. And also be assured that they can also depend on the world to produce things that maybe they themselves cannot produce. And just to make this clear, for example, maybe Kenya is not best place to produce its own cars, or maybe let's say phones, but it maybe probably is good at producing cut flowers or tea or whatever for a section of the world and for themselves. So trade has been growing exponentially since the 1970s, and in almost half a century, trade has risen to 56.6% of GDP as of 2024. So what does this tell you? That of the global output, trade trade is more than 50% of that portion. And this means that trade is highly significant in global output. And of course, 21 to 27% of the total trade is in services. And what this tells you is that the service trade is also growing over time, although it has remained relatively at 20 to 27%. So on the next slide, we realize that since 1990s, the amount of goods and services, and this is in volumes that have been traded, have grown 9 times. So, and as you can see, the gradient of this index shows you that trade has been growing, not only growing, but it has been growing at a very steep pace. And this shows you that there's a big market for goods globally. And also the supply has also essentially grown, since nobody would supply if demand does not exist. And this, as you can see, it was a bit stagnant in the beginning, in the 1980s, but it has grown. And of course, the sharp falls both in 2008, in 2020, and also you can see it around 2000. It's because of the global shocks. But even so, you can see that trade never fell significantly, although the shocks affected them. And what this tells you is that people continue to exchange goods irrespective of what is happening in the world. And this is a good sign, because there's one of the fears people have with international trade is that at some point other countries will decide not to sell to others and leaving them vulnerable. Now, this can heavily be illustrated using sanctions. When Russia was sanctioned because of their invasion to Ukraine, they started complaining that they were being limited to trade with the world. What does that show you? That the fear that we'll get to a point and people will decide they will not share their goods with the world is not even possible, because those who have been limited from doing that for one way or another are pushing to be allowed to do the same. And therefore, trade is not necessarily, is not only good by an end at itself, it's also an argument for peace, because interdependence in international trade allow people to negotiate, it allow people to talk, it allow people to exchange things, and therefore it also pushes the world towards a more peaceful stance. So in the next slide, we'll check how has trade and welfare interacted with each other. And why is this important? First of all, as Emmanuel stated before, at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we believe in pushing towards prosperity. And one of the way of achieving this is enhancing freedoms, both social, political, and economic freedom. So to measure economic freedoms, and this is, of course, how much consumer surplus exists, how much goods people can access, and also how prosperous people are. And one of the measures of prosperity is to just test how poor are we as a nation. And as you can see here, and forgive the data gaps shown on the orange line, well, this line shows you two things. The blue line shows you trade participation, and this shows you how much goods were exported from lower middle income countries, and Kenya falls within this category. Remember, countries are categorized depending on their GDP per capita. And given that Kenya's GDP per capita is within 2,000 US dollar per annum as of last year, it shows you that these countries have been increasingly participating in international trade. And as you can see, as of 2024, about 7% of world export comes from low middle income countries, and Kenya is amongst these. At the same time as trade has been growing, as these countries have been increasing their participation in trade, poverty has been falling. Now, these two are correlated in this one explanation. Number one, international trade increased price competition. And why is that important as far as poverty is concerned? So for example, if a country can produce phones at a cheaper price than Kenya can produce, it means being open to international trade, Kenyans can be able to purchase cheaper phones of good quality from other parts of the world, and they focus their limited resources in producing, for example, their premium tea, which they can sell to the world at higher price. Why is that important? Number one, competition increases efficiency. So local producers are also, due to competition, are encouraged to be more efficient. So what happens here is they will produce things more efficiently, meaning the prices will go down. And once prices go down, it means holding income constant, and well, incomes have been stagnating for a while in the country. But even so, incomes grow, have a behavior of growing. And therefore, if prices are lower, it means people have more bandwidth of expenditure, and therefore their lives become better from that perspective. But not only that, on the producer end, it also helps the economy to stabilize within the equilibrium, and therefore enable the producers to know whether how to enhance one, the production, or what lines they should move to if they are not competitive enough. Number two, Kenya is 80% arid and semi-arid. And what that tells you is it has deficiency of water. Now, Kenyans like their cereals. We all know we like maize, we like our beans and all that. And cereals are water-heavy crops. And given there is that restraint, the nexus of we love our cereals, there's shortage of water, we have a fixed set of land. So some of the foods we consume will have to be bought from elsewhere. And therefore, opening and participating in trade gives us a chance to purchase food from whichever place once we are constrained. And why is this important? Number one, as the Constitution of Kenya states, people have a right to access to food, and therefore the global supply gives us a chance to do that. Not only that, it increases the number of choices we have in terms of what we want to consume. And also this can also be seen in the sense that, for example, research, and you can check this research on the IE website, shows that Kenyans prefer apparels and footwear that are below 1,000 bob or within the 1,000 price. The new text apparel produced in Kenya are above that price. But due to international trade availability of a market, Kenyan produce for markets with higher income, such as the US market, where we export our apparels. And then we open our borders to allow us to have more affordable clothes from elsewhere. And that leaves us at a better place. But even so, the other nexus of trade and poverty is Kenya does not necessarily consume everything produced in Kenya. And global markets, and this is international trade, it creates markets, or it avails market which otherwise would not have been available to us had international trade not existed. For example, Kenya barely consume all of its tea, and thank God for international trade. They can sell it to the US, they can sell it to England. Kenyans maybe only when there is Valentine and it's February do not appreciate their flowers that much, and therefore we have a market in Europe where we take our flowers. So once this market emerges, the people producing these things within the country are able to create jobs, given that they can sell outside the country, and therefore they can create jobs for Kenyans, which translates to people earning incomes. And once people make incomes, their lives become better. Remember, for Kenya to be able to raise the income profile of its citizen, it must also allow itself to participate in international trade. One, because as of today, Kenya is a low-income country, meaning that people don't have so much incomes. And to enhance this, one of the things we can do is allow ourselves to trade in the country, which we have, maybe not necessarily at an optimum level, and we are going to discuss that in the next slide. But Kenya has a chance to optimize its chances and to reduce its poverty just using international trade. So on the next slide, we ask ourselves, how does Kenya compare with the world as far as international trade is concerned? So the main important thing here you should take pick is that Kenya is a small open economy. And so I'm going to use a minute to belabor that point. So Kenya contribute about 0.06% of the share of the total trade as of 2024. So what does this tell you? That if Kenyan export were to be removed from the face of the world, only 0.06% of it would be reduced. Now, some countries has about 20 or more share on total trade. So this gives you the reality of Kenya, that Kenya is small in terms of its production. And being a small country, what it tells you is you cannot set the price. So if your contribution is not that high, it means you cannot tell the world, we have raised our prices, you either take them or deal with them. Because since our contribution is small, the world will just tell us, we'll just proceed without you. But some countries have more shares, and it means that they can actually tell the world that we are raising our price. So what does that make us? That makes us price taker. Kenya is a price taker as far as international trade is involved. So what does that tell us? Is that we don't have the bargaining power to sit down with countries and tell them that if you don't do this, we are going to limit these and you guys will suffer in terms of prices. And with that recognition, it means anytime we sit on an agreement table to negotiate, and as I can see in the people who has joined our webinar today, we have people represented from the Foreign Affairs Ministry in the country. These people, when they go to negotiate for our country, which they do, and we appreciate that, they don't have so much leeway in terms of bargaining power with other countries. Is that necessarily a bad thing? No, but it shows this forms the foundation of what Kenya's stance should be as far as global institution is involved. So if you look at this one, I tried to explain this previously, that Kenya cannot fully grow all food that it requires. But that does not mean Kenya cannot feed itself. All it means is Kenya has to buy food from other countries as it sells some of its goods to other countries. And therefore, we will not have a constraint on food provision in the country as far as we allow foods to trick into to flow inside the country, and also allow ourselves to use our land, our resources, and allow farms in Kenya to produce things that they have more competitive edge, which is necessary here called comparative advantage against other countries in the world. And with these facts, and having to realize that, one, we are a small open country, so we are price takers, we have limited bargaining power, and therefore it means our negotiation and our agreement making process is of course highly costful to us. We ask the question, what should Kenya's stance on international trade be? But before we answer this, I'll invite Emmanuel to tell us what has been the stance from other countries as far as WTO is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Moses. So, the World Trade Organization, what's important to understand is this: just like other parts of the multilateral system, it's designed in just like a government, right? You have something of an executive in the form of the ministerial conference, right? Then you have something of a legislative body. Also, the ministerial conference carries out some functions like an executive. And then you have a body that is, an organ that's supposed to adjudicate, right? To decide, to make decisions and on disputes, to sort of process when countries have conflicts related to trade. So the countries of the world had to agree on how to form these organs and how the whole World Trade Organization will be constituted. And one of the important mechanisms is that the World Trade Organization functions in some ways like a democracy, but because of different countries' endowments, their resource endowments, right? Their total makeup, the bargaining power that they have. Some countries are price takers in the world trading system, while others are price makers. Some countries have more bargaining power than others. So, the United States of America, for example, the largest economy in the world. So the global economy is around $100 trillion, and about 30 trillion of that is global trade. The US economy is just past 30 trillion, the Chinese economy just around 28 trillion. So these countries have much more what you could call our higher escalatory ceiling. If they enter into a dispute with a given country, they can escalate more, which means they can absorb more cost, which is another way to say that they have more bargaining power. So as we stand today, one of the important functions of the World Trade Organization that is, you could say, dysfunctional is the dispute resolution mechanism. How is it dysfunctional? Well, because after a given period of time, the countries must agree and propose and vote on the appointment of new members to what is called the appellate body. Because when countries have a trade dispute and they appeal, the appeal is heard at that appellate body. And so these countries have to agree on the constitution of that body. And given that the World Trade Organization is a democratic institution, every country has, any country can actually stand up and veto a given process. But now, why would a country like Kenya hesitate in vetoing any process? Well, because it doesn't have escalatory power. Because if you veto a process, other countries look at you and they ask themselves, okay, first they might question the quality of the veto, but then also they might retaliate, maybe directly in terms of trade, but also indirectly, depending on the endowments that they have. Now, we can lay out these endowments to say, in addition to the size of the economy, different countries have different, instruments of power, right? How much influence do they have over the financial system? How far does their diplomatic system, the reach of their diplomatic system, right? How much weight do they have in the global political system? what is the size and what does their military do? So, for example, in the case of the United States, one of the functions that their military engages in is what is called freedom of navigation. So they enforce freedom of navigation, which contributes to the global public goods in terms of security, so that ships can cross the oceans freely. Now they do it for their own trade, but they also do it to such a degree and so far across the world that other countries also benefit. So, and then they have the largest diplomatic corps in the world. They have a large number of they say their analytical capabilities in terms of institutionally, and also the number of negotiators and expert negotiators they have means that they generally know more about what's going on than other countries, right? I think France has the second largest number of embassies across the world. So this means that this country has more options and knows more about what's going on in the world than other countries, right? So the United States in the year 2019 decided to veto the appointment of members to the appellate body, and this effectively destroyed the process of dispute resolution. What happened after that is that whenever a dispute arose, countries, if they escalated it to the appellate body, they would engage in what has been known as appealing into the void. So essentially, today, appeals are just thrown into they are not heard. So what this means is that because disputes are not resolved, then countries sort of start to trade in an area where there's no rules. Now, final point is this: why did the United States uh, throw a wrench into this system? Well, it had a couple of objections. One of the important objections was this: the United States felt that the dispute resolution mechanism had judges who were actually legislating, and it took issue with the legislation activities by these judges because it felt that this was a sort of legal advocacy activity that they didn't agree with. Why? Because this was going against the sovereignty of it was taken away from the sovereignty. Now the judges, or the sovereignty of given countries. Now the judges, for their part, responded in this way. They said the reason that we look like we're starting to make trade law was because we felt it necessary to start to create precedents when we're hearing these appeals. So this is just one of the issues that the United States had. Now, what other issues did the United States have with the world trading system? Now, remember, as we continue, the United States, just like many countries in the world, has benefited greatly. In fact, the United States, Germany, and China are some of the greatest beneficiaries from global trade in terms of the contributions to the average welfare of the average American, the average German, the average Chinese. All these nationals, and just like many nationals from around the world, have benefited from the system of global trade. Number two, the nations of the world are very tightly integrated, and that's the statistic. That's what Moses tried to demonstrate in his part of the presentation, was that trade, unlike the impression that we might get from the news, which will tend towards political matters and security matters, the world is just too intertwined in trade. Now, not only is the world very intertwined in trade, the it's just too complex. Now, given that, the United States says, number one, plurilateral agreements should be allowed and members' consent on obligations should be sought. What does this mean? What happened is that in the years between the founding of the World Trade Organization and the present day, uh, because The World Trade Organization is a democratic system, and countries must all agree before a matter becomes, say, a rule, right? A matter that was under negotiation becomes a rule. All the members of the body must agree. If a single nation objects, that process stalls. So when process is kept stalling in what is known in the trade world as the Doha round, well, nations noticed this and decided that they were going to sort of huddle together and just get things going with those countries that agree, because they felt that the WTO, the whole body was not moving together, so things weren't moving. So the United States thinks that this huddling together, what is now called plurilateral agreements, should be allowed. Now, the idea, the proposal is in red because we at the Institute of Economic Affairs disagree. We disagree because we think that that's a trend that is actually destroying the world trading system, that we're not supposed to be balkanizing into blocks. We should be moving together. Now, members' consent on obligations should be sought. Now, we think again that no, the nations of the world should agree together. The second point, special and differential treatment should be revised, and all members should follow the rules, save for LDC, least developed countries, for a specific period. Now we agree. No, special differential treatment means that poorer countries, their level should be considered within the trading system. When proposals are being made, it should always be considered that these nations are poor. Why? Because even as global trade delivers welfare benefits to nations and nationals, citizens of the world, firms and households, well, it does happen that firms and households sometimes get left behind. How? Because sometimes when the competition is too stiff and domestic firms can't compete, well, now they need a little bit of help. And so these kind of yawning disparities, these asymmetries are recognized. And so the United States thinks that this should be revised. How? Well, because some nations like China have gotten very wealthy, but are taking advantage of their status and claiming, hey, we're poor, we still need X, Y, or Z kind of provision. And the United States disagrees. Another country like Singapore, right? Per capita now is about just beyond $60,000. So it's not a poor country, so it shouldn't have special and differential treatment. And with that, we agree at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The third point, enhanced notification obligations with technical help offered to least developed countries. Within the global system, one of the important mechanisms that allows this system to work is we need to know what each country is doing and that each country is actually meeting its obligations. And this is done by in different ways. One of the important ways the country actually notifies the world and says, we are complying with X, Y, and Z obligation. So they offer a notification, but countries differ in their capability to offer these notifications. The United States thinks that countries need help to develop, they need technical help to make these reports. And we agree because it's a good institutional measure. The other offerings made by the United States are that the most favored nation should be reformed to allow for differential treatment for different WTO members. Now, a principle of the world trading system is that countries should not give favors to some countries that they don't give to others. This is the most favored nation principle. So every nation should be a most favored nation. The United States thinks that this should be reformed so that some nations are more favored than others. We disagree because we think that this is a regression in the global trading system and it's not a positive trend. Another offering is that the role of the Secretariat should be member determined administrative rather than research based and decision making influential. What does this mean? The WTO has developed a specialization in matters and issues of trade. So they know a lot about trade. They are a think tank unto themselves in terms of trade. But the World Trade, the United States doesn't think that the World Trade Organization should be developing all these in-depth reports and furthering its knowledge of the advancements in global trades and trends and that sort of thing and other related issues. And it thinks that the World Trade Organization should actually be reduced to a clearinghouse to trade. Now, we disagree. We think that that this is not the World Trade Organization should not be reduced to a clearinghouse for trade and just clerks sort of stamping their approval on trade. No. Another point that the United States thinks that the World Trade Organization should allow members to protect their security interests. We disagree. We don't think that issues of security and defense should actually belong in this forum, the World Trade Organization. We think that these issues are best left elsewhere to be dealt with in other arms of the multilateral system, right? We already have the United States General Assembly and its Security Council. Those matters should be heard there and not here at the World Trade Organization. We think that it's a complication that just doesn't belong. Well, what about the European Union? Now, the European Union's total GDP is about 16 trillion, so just about half of the United States, but it's still very large, right? It's smaller than China, but very large. So its proposals also are important. Now, the EU thinks that the World Trade Organization should maintain a rule-based and robust dispute settlement system for predictability. We at the Institute of Economic Affairs agree. I Because fundamentally predictability is important, right? And in fact, it's the one of the vital because from an economic standpoint, what we want is to that households and firms from across the world can discover the equilibrium. So they need to receive price signals, clear price signals, consistency, that predictability. What that means for households and firms is that their consumer and producer surplus continues to be maximized. Trade should include a reflection now on the overall balance, policy coherence, and coordinated action. Now, what does this mean? So, um, what the European Union is proposing here is that they're also concerned about stalling processes, that that we need new mechanisms to arrive at agreements faster. For example, thresholds on agreement. How many countries, for example, do we need to agree on a proposal in order for the world trading system to move forward? We need mechanisms to remove the opportunities for disruptions by single countries, because these are incumbents to the global trading agenda. What about adjustments of tariff levels in light of threats to certain sectors or value chains? So this we think is a proposal towards protectionism, and we disagree with it. Um, what we think is that it's we don't advocate for cruelty here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We rather propose that, so for example, protectionism will be driven by whom? By producers, right? In let's say producer driven protectionism as a case study. Producers can influence their negotiators, trade negotiators, to erect barriers. Now, even though we agree that there are instances where the asymmetries between there are asymmetries in wealth and welfare that are driven by globalization. We don't think that there should be provisions that allow the world to move back towards protectionism. Rather, we think that policymakers need to have some courage and also operate in truth and sit down with, let's say, if it's tomato producers in Florida, right, who maybe want uh, barriers so that they don't compete against cheaper Mexican producers. We think that politicians should have some courage in facing them and saying, okay, we're going to look for a way to to soften your landing as you move towards, like Moses mentioned, discovering different markets. But this is why we think trade is good, because of the overall welfare effect, say for consumers. So we're not going to let you fall through the holes, but we don't want to move back towards protectionism. Now, the other point, we clarify the World Trade Organization agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. So we think that it's true that, for instance, the European Union, we think that this line is aimed at a country like China, and the concern that they are very competitive due to their the subsidies that they offer for their manufacturers, and that they are able to get away with these what are called countervailing measures, which is a response to perceived or actualized threat against an industry from competitiveness from competitive foreign firms. We agree that we need to move further and further away from the sort of, say, industrial policy subsidies that are protectionist. What about the transparency regime contains too few incentives to notify? So this hitches on the other point offered earlier, which is that the World Trade Organization, and then within the World Trade trading system, transparency is what allows for countries to confirm that they're actually moving together in terms of lowering barriers to trade. Um, but because this transparency is based on countries actually offering the information saying we are remaining faithful to the global trading system, the European Union thinks that the regime has too few incentives to notify. We agree. We need more incentives for countries to come out and say the truth about their participation in this system. SDDT should be targeted and time bound. So these are special differential treatment. Some again, this is similar to the point offered by the United States, which is some countries like China or Singapore are too are their special differential treatment is the time overhang is too long. They're being treated as poor countries for much longer than is necessary. So we agree that this should be targeted and time bound. We need to escalate and to ascertain a country's status within the system in a more precise manner and move them from when they no longer qualify for certain privileges. Operationalize responsible consensus as opposed to a practice of unanimity. So this again hitches back on that the process of agreement, that we need to come to a place where we can operationalize a new threshold for consensus. Now, accommodating different types of plurilateral and club approaches, this again we disagree, because this proposal here is again just like the one proposed by the United States, moving us away from a multilateral system of free trade and moving towards balkanized systems of free trade. Now you can tell that we differ in our sort of a definition and how we frame trade. Economists have something they call mercantilist ideas of trade, whereby we're looking at trade in terms of, are we winning as a country against other countries? And we say no, trade is carried out by households and firms. and that trade is not about, so for example, with AFTA, is not about blocking trade from the world and trading from each other. It's about lowering barriers everywhere. So we think that this point goes against that. And so I'll invite Moses to elaborate further on these contested clauses.
Thanks, Emmanuel. So, what Emmanuel has told us is, what does the US think? What does EU think? And we highlighted in red some of the things that we think are contentious, and as Kenyans or Kenya, we should have a strong stand against. Now, remember, we are building a case or a negotiation for reforms that are in favor, that optimizes and maximizes benefit to Kenya. And for us to do this, remember, in next month in Yaoundé in Cameroon, ministers of finance or were related ministry appointed in each country will be meeting under WTO to discuss WTO issues. And one of the things that will be highly contested and discussed this time around is WTO reforms, which have been on the forefront for a while now. And so here we are going to highlight what clauses in the WTO agreements are people having an issue with. And then at the end of each clause, we'll say what side should Kenya take and why we think they should take that side. Remember, our sole purpose as the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya is to push toward prosperity. And one of the simplest way to measure prosperity is reduced poverty. And we are saying for our country to have less poverty and more prosperous people, international trade is a significant thing that we need to appreciate. And given that we are a small open country and we don't have enough market to sell everything we produce, and we don't have the capacity to produce everything we consume, and therefore we appreciate the fact that international trade makes us better off, whether it is the story around it is told in that manner or not. And so what are these contested clauses? And the first one in the next slide is the most favored nations. And what does this clause say? In the WTO agreement, it's agreed that all member countries of WTO, once they have a treatment on one country, they extend it to all others. Now, under this clause, there's also bounded tariffs adherence. And what this means is a country has to state what is the highest, what is the floor and the ceiling of each tariff line they have. Why is this important? International trade thrives under a predictable situation. Like anybody of you know, or probably what you should know, is that anybody who is selling and buying something would need a level of predictability for them to be able to exist and also to make profit or generate income from the exchange of buying and selling. Similarly, international trade is buying and selling at an international level. And for this to efficiently happen, whereby there is reduced transaction costs, and people are aware that the gap of change lies within these lines, and therefore we can act within this line. It makes it more efficient to trade, and it also makes it incentivizes people to join in the trade. And therefore, bounded tariffs adherence is a country stating that we will not tariff goods more than 10%, and and that enables anybody trading in that realizing that this is the cost that we can incur within this margin. Now, some members feel that the commitment to this clause should be done away with because some countries have been violating this. Well, it's important to notice that developing countries, and this is heavily also an African problem, have been using some of the safeguard and preferential treatment under WTO to make sure that they tariff the goods entering their country very highly. Now, that's distortionary, and some of the countries feel because of that, we should do away with the most favored nation. Now, we believe that Kenya should stand behind the most favored nation clause as it is, and it should not be done away with. Why? Number one, we understand the farms in Kenya that produce different goods would want to trade in a predictable environment. And MFN is one of the clauses. First of all, it's the foundation clause that why WTO exists. It's also the foundation clause of multilateralism. And we know as far as international trade is concerned, that is the best case scenario. And therefore, if this is changed, most countries will become protectionist. That's number one. And number two, this means that every country will have to negotiate with the other country, and there will be unpredictability in the fact that countries can change their behavior. And case studies what the US did on quote unquote Liberation Day. They decided to change the landscape of international trade by issuing tariffs, hence violating this principle. And we can see the chaos that this caused across the world. And therefore, by doing away with this clause or editing it to allow that some countries to have some leeway, then it means these chaotic signs that were witnessed when the United States decided to violate this clause will be all over. And this is not only bad for business, it's bad for consumers, and also it's bad for prosperity. And as we have seen, international trade has a correlation with reduction in poverty. And we feel this is one of the justifiable clause that should exist as it is. Now, on the next slide, the other issue that is highly contested is special and differentiated treatment. And why is this? Some countries have taken advantage of the needy or developing countries category to ensure they don't follow some of the rules, and therefore they are given differentiated treatment under WTO. We agree that some countries, especially those that have heavily benefited from this, such as China, and we have no problem with China doing business with the world. All we have to say is, well, China has amassed quite significant amount of wealth. They have been growing. Maybe it's time they're removed from the, well, they did notify WTO way later than they should have. But also, Africa abuses this clause too much, whereby countries in Africa impose tariffs on imports, citing that that's how government generates revenue, which is true. Government generates some revenue from tariffs, but this makes consumers worse off. And therefore, we feel and we support the European Union stand that this special and differentiated treatment should exist for least developed countries or needy countries, but it needs to be clarified on how much time a country should be given until it enters in the list of following all the rules under which WTO operates. And this country should be targeted with a clear verification so that we know when they need to exist. And therefore, we feel the Kenyan representative and Kenyans should urge their representative to support the clarification of the special and differentiated treatment. Now, the other issue in the next slide is on custom on electronic transmission. As we all know, when digital trades started happening, WTO members met and decided that tariffs should not be imposed on digital products. So this agreement by WTO members is set to expire on the 31st of March, that is next month, or at the conclusion of MC14, and MC14 here is the Ministerial Council meeting that will happen in Yaoundé, Cameroon, which happens on a periodic calendar where ministers representing different countries come to discuss issues under international trade. And well, now if it expires, it means countries will be at liberty to impose tariffs on digital products. We all know here in Kenya that when the government of Kenya tried to impose taxes on digital products, there were a bit of resistance, and rightly so, because one of the things about digital products is, first of all, the cost that will be incurred, to the administration cost that will be incurred to ensure that the government can track and be able to tax this will be so high. Number two, it will reduce efficiency too much. And well, major digital exporters like the US and the EU feel that WTO members should agree that at no time should we have tariffs on electronic transmission. Well, countries like India, Indonesia, and South Africa are are of the point that we should let the moratorium to lapse, and therefore countries will be at liberty of imposing tariffs on digital products. So, what do we think should happen? Well, we think Kenya should take the US and the EU side by saying the moratorium should extended, but on a best practice, we think we should have a permanent ban on tariffs on digital products. And why is this so? One, because of the complexity of the nature of digital products, and therefore the administration cost will be too high. The other thing is that digital products are one of the things that can help developing countries like ours to have a quick convergence with the developed nations. And for us to be able to take advantage of that fact, then we need to allow free trade in digital products. And we think that's something Kenya should be willing to do. Now, one of the complications here is how will government get revenue from this electronic transmission? And we feel if government wants to get revenue from this, then imposing tariffs is the worst way. Maybe government should, after things are imported into the country or this digital, maybe the WTO members should consider countries and encouraging countries, instead of taking this from a trade perspective, to take it as a domestic policy issue where countries can decide what VAT to impose on what. But it shouldn't become WTO decide what VAT is imposed on what. But our argument here is that the moratorium on having no custom duty on electronic transmission should be permanently adopted or should be extended, as that's the best case scenario. So the next issue that has been contentious is about investments facilitation. Now, Emmanuel mentioned something very important, that we believe WTO is best placed to discuss trade matters. As far as trade of goods and services is involved, WTO mandate should start and end at that. Now, by WTO deciding to try and create a transparent, predictable environment for foreign direct investment, we feel WTO is overreaching its mandate. And in this case, it should not be in WTO's mandate to help developing nations to attract sustainable capital. Rather, countries, after seeing how important it is to engage in international trade and the benefit its citizens accrue, should change their policy landscape to attract more investment. And therefore, we feel that, and India and South Africa have historically blocked inclusion of investment facilitation in the WTO legal framework, and we feel that's a good stand, and Kenya should take that stand. The WTO should focus on trades of goods and services, and specific countries should change their policy landscape to encourage capital inflow, sustainable capital, and foreign direct investment. The reason why we feel this is because, well, throwing everything at WTO will, one, build so much trade-offs. Number two, it will increase the amount of dispute that need to be solved at WTO level. And given that we have other organizations under the UN that are premised to do with development issues, we feel that those issues should be discussed at that level. And therefore, in this case, we think India and South Africa, irrespective of what their motives for blocking this is, have a more sane stance than any other side. So on the next slide, we ask ourselves on the dispute settlement system. So one of the main important things in the WTO is dispute settlement. And this is because, just as any other landscape, dispute arise in the international trade landscape. And therefore, a robust mechanism to allow members to be able to solve their dispute is important. And some of the reforms that we have encouraged whether supporting EU, US, or any other recommended reforms, and we are going to mention what Kenya's recommended reforms should be. We feel, number one, understanding Kenya as a small and open country, supporting the dispute settlement system is important. Why? Because at this level, at an international level, it means Kenya can be able to call to negotiate with countries who have more power, who would otherwise have more bargaining cards than Kenya, on a table of negotiation or at a less cost if it's done at a WTO level. And therefore, it's in the best interest of Kenya that it to support DSS, and maybe other countries want it to be reformed to make it more effective, and that's a good thing. But it should be encouraged that, remember, DSS privileged members, regardless of their size or economic power, that if you have an issue of contention, you can raise it through DSS, and WTO will facilitate a negotiation, and they will solve the problem, and that should be quickened so that we allow trade to keep going on. And therefore, Kenya should take a stand in support of DSS, and it's in the best interest of Kenya for its people, its farms, and anybody from a foreign country who is willing to invest in Kenya, that we have a platform where, irrespective of how small and open we are, and therefore our bargaining power is limited, that we can be able to negotiate with the world. We can be able to bargain with the powers of the world at a lower cost. So on the next slide, we ask ourselves, based on this realization and these facts, what stance should Kenya take? Like, well, the US have said what the reforms they think should be done, and we highlight in red some of which we disagree with, and the others which we agree. The EU has said Kenya is yet to write to the WTO on the reforms they support, but nevertheless, as we stated in MC14, which will happen in Yaoundé in Cameroon next month, Kenyan representative will have a chance to discuss these reforms. So what do we think Kenyan representatives should advocate for? Number one, we encourage a predictable international landscape platform. And with that said, it means there's a case that WTO is highly needed. Just as the European Union clearly stated, the world needs WTO. Why? Because a rule-based order provides predictability, both for those who are producing, those who are consuming, and what that means, transaction costs are lower than if that did not happen. Number two, understanding the fact that dispute will always arise in international trade, and therefore we need a dispute resolution mechanism that is more efficient, is able to tackle these issues, and therefore we should encourage, as WTO, as other nations have shown, that the WTO dispute settlement system should reform to allow, first of all, by reducing the veto of, by disabling the veto power of a single individual member and allowing certain threshold of consensus to have agreement move on. We think that's an important thing. And that we should encourage, we should agree, and Kenya should support in agreeing that notification of is important at an international trade level. And given the technical ability and the cost incurred in notifying, WTO should aid the poorest nation in developing a mechanism on how to ensure that happens. But this notification should be, and we'll see this in the next slide, but before we move, allow me to talk about the issue of cheating. Notification will help reduce cheating. Why? Because it reduces information asymmetry between trading partners in this case. And therefore, to address the issue of asymmetry between developed and developing countries and cheating, notification, technical ability, cost incurred, especially by poor nations which have no incentive to do the notification, should be aided. And WTO have had a mechanism to do this. But to clarify this, and as we move in the next slide, we see the cost and the technical ability is quite high. And therefore, we feel with a time-bound and targeted approach, WTO should be able to help, number one, by ensuring that wherever there is uncovered and notified things, WTO is given the mandate and the power to notify themselves to other members, but also the fact that they should be enabled to, on a targeted and term-bound phase, to help poor nations be able to acquire enough technical ability and also to be able to assist these people to be able to notify. For example, in a Kenyan scenario, the Kenyan government or Kenya representative in the WTO can ask the WTO to help enhance their notifying mechanism, and WTO should be willing to come in for a specified time period, not only to help in the notification, but also to help build the technical knowledge. We also feel that Kenya should support the definition and clarification of who should be in the neediest list, what preference should they get, and what special treatment should get. And this should also be encouraged to be time bound. Why? One of the things that we highly witness, and if you've been following the Institute of Economic Affairs, last year we tried to bring to light how much protectionist Kenya is. Why is that important? Protectionism, whereas it might give some people some rents and also favor some producers, it puts everybody, in the long run, it will make everybody worse off. But even in the short run, it makes consumers worse off. And therefore, defining and clarifying who should be exempted from some rules for what, because they are in the neediest list, what time they should be in that list, and what would be required of them until to a point where they are able to follow the rules of WTO fully. Because we feel Kenya, for example, should be more open than it is, but it gets the leeway of not being open even after being a member of WTO, because those special and differentiated treatments are not directly clarified on how they should be. And we feel as NC14 comes, that clarification needs to come as far as Kenya is concerned and also other developing countries. Now, Emmanuel, we come here, and this is in the benefit of those who negotiate for Kenya and elsewhere in the world, and will tell us what do we think should be the foundation of negotiators? What should negotiators have in mind when they are negotiating for these international trade agreements and also under WTO? Emmanuel.
Thank you, Moses. So, what should trade negotiators negotiate about? So, we think here at the Institute of Economic Affairs that trade negotiators should be focused on free trade, be free trade purists. So, for example, in Kenya's policy discourse, Singapore has come up as a model. Well, one of the attributes of Singapore is that it's an open economy. Singapore, as a small country, is a price taker, just like Kenya has a low bargaining power. Well, maybe a bit more than Kenya does, but still, it's a small country. But what did Singapore do? Singapore and another good example of Hong Kong pursued a policy of unilateral free. They liberalized their trade unilaterally, which means they did not wait for other countries to give them a favor before they gave one back. They didn't look for reciprocity. They placed their faith in a principle of free trade, the principle that free trade ultimately makes everyone together better off, maximizes welfare of consumers and producers across on both sides. And so they said, look, rather than go through the cost, say, of organizing to negotiate with every single country one by one, right? Because that means you have to hire negotiators for that. You have to pay for the analysis for each single case. We think that trade is not war. You don't sit down and try and maximize your trade surplus. Rather, free trade, open up your borders, whether or not other countries are trying to open up theirs. Place faith in the fact that you will find and continue to develop comparative advantages, right? In instances where, in order to contribute to the process of discovering new comparative advantages, right? And improving your position of relative comparative advantage, invest in research and development because we see from the economic complexity index the unit that you should ultimately be worried about is knowledge intensity. But knowledge is, you cannot predict and then restrict the development of knowledge in a predictable fashion. Rather, if you allow for the free movement of the factors of production and of labor, uh, what you will find, and of goods and services, is that individuals who can only have a certain limited amount of knowledge in their heads, they are incentivized. They want to create very complex products. They have very advanced ideas. But for example, in order to make a MacBook Air or to build the electronic device through which we are all engaged in using right now together in this webinar, you can't put all that knowledge in one person's head because you have upstream, you have the knowledge of extracting, say, the petroleum, and then differentiating it to the point you get the different plastics and polymers required to build that. Maybe it's that MacBook Air or that laptop that you're using, and the metals also extracting those ores. All this knowledge doesn't belong in one head, but actually is distributed all across the globe in what you might call the global value chain. So the value chain is a reflection of what? It's ultimately, most at its most fundamental, that people with so many uh, diverse endowments of knowledge are able to come together and create all these different products. So the MacBook Air required someone who knew how to develop the software, and not just one software, but so many different pieces of software from the most foundational to those at the surface level. And then other engineers to come and put this together and make specialize in building the screens, others specialize in the metals, the plastics, the polymers, all these things coming together. And then uh, because these specializations sort of emerge all across the globe, and they come together and they're all distributed across different parts of the value chain, upstream in the services, upstream in the extractive industry, in manufacturing, in the services, all the design. So it's to the advantage, the benefit of different countries to open up the borders so that people can find each other. And in order to climb that ladder, that's why we mentioned those investments in research and development. And then what you want to see happen is that you have the development of research, then the development of technology, and then the application of technology in the production of specific goods. And then when you're producing these goods, you generate jobs because of you need people to work in producing these different goods. So a government cannot possibly predict each and every one of these different points of the value chain, but must stand back and allow for people to find themselves in this emergent reality that is global trade, the emergent reality that is the economy. So fundamentally, we are saying that governments should have faith in the emergent property of markets. You know what we're saying is, when you wake up in the morning, there's no government that can possibly tell you what you need to do, because you need to, maybe you groom yourself, and then you need to make run this or that errand, and then you get to your workplace, and your specific firm needs to do this or that, and it's responding to price signals, and the price signals are compressing in so much dense information that no government can possibly process on behalf of the firm. So, but why doesn't this happen? The reason that this doesn't happen is because of political pressures from domestic parties that condition trade agreements. This is driven by zombie ideas. So we call them zombie ideas because they refuse to die. We already know the value of free trade. We see the value of free trade reflected in the wealth of a country like Singapore, a country that didn't wait for anyone to open their borders in a reciprocal fashion, but opened them outrightly. A small country that Singapore can't grow its own food, right? But actually, Singapore accesses food because they're rich enough to buy food from the world. Remember another experiment, Qatar. Qatar was blockaded by different countries for a period of for no, I think it was more than 12 months. But because they were so rich, I think their per capita is about $160,000. Qataris were flying in cows from around the world to feed themselves when they were blockaded. They could access food because they were rich, not because they had land to grow it. And the land endowments you have are limited. Remember, Moses mentioned you can only grow so many flowers. So, but the reason that it's the challenge of sitting down with different parties, households, and firms, and actually courageously telling them that protectionism isn't to your favor. You need competition. It's sitting down and telling them this is what Samsung went through. It became globally competitive. The Japanese auto manufacturers that we mentioned earlier. So we think that the World Trade Organization has become encumbered by issues that it shouldn't be bothered with. We think that actually, even issues of human rights, issues of climate change, issues of defense and security don't belong at the World Trade Organization as a forum. They belong elsewhere and should be kept out. The World Trade Organization and its part doesn't need to start pursuing these different things in order to legitimize itself. For example, if that was what it was looking for, that it's doing enough in being a place to discuss and agree on purely trade and purely the matter of opening up borders and letting factors of production move across borders and goods and services. So trade has become excessively technical, too much um, you know, bureaucracy that just doesn't belong there. So, in conclusion, the WTO should focus solely on trade in goods and services. Kenya should appreciate that it's a small and open economy and it needs the WTO. Kenya needs multilateralism in general, and it needs the WTO in particular. After, and all the East African community should not be vehicles of shutting the world out. They should be vehicles for opening up multilateralism. Stop complicating it with this and that technical. Focus on reducing the barriers to trade. So Kenya just doesn't have the escalatory power of a country like the United States. Now, again, to emphasize this point, the United States was contributing almost more than 30% of the financial outlays for the totality of the multilateral system. So the multilateral system is what? You have the UN system. You have what were sometimes called the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. You have the World Trade Organization, and then you have all those other agencies and other organs that make up the multilateral system. We have tried to provide global goods through these systems. The UN, so all this put together, the budget doesn't even surpass that of the New York City Police Department, right? So we've accomplished so much on less than what the New York City Police Department spends annually. And a country like Kenya, even within that, you compare what the amounts, the outlays that Kenya makes to build this system that it greatly benefits from, that it cannot even possibly fund the New York City Police Department. This is a call for both humility, but also of asking us to take stock of the benefits we have already accrued and say, this is a system worth defending. This is a system worth fighting for. And with that, we'll invite you all to and open up the floor for questions. So questions can be put in there's a question and answer box in there in this Teams system, but you can also put your hand up and we will allow you to actually speak. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, everybody. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and then we'll give you permission to ask. Or you can put it in the question and answer or in the chat box and we'll be willing to respond and to hear from you. Any takers?
Remember again where we are in the world as you prepare your questions is this. The World Trade Organization is functions just like your typical government, right? This is a Westphalian inspired institution. And one of the issues right now is that it's the equivalent of the judicial branch is not functioning. So I see a question here by Dennis. Okay, so we're going to allow you to speak. Dennis?
Thank you very much, the Institute of Economic Affairs, for this, for inviting us to this webinar. Very important. Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure,
you're audible.
Okay, my name is Dennis Muhambe. I work with the State Department for Foreign Affairs and have an interest in trade policy, trade law, the multilateral trading system. So I'd like to, first of all, thank you for putting together this session, a very important and timely session as we prepare for the 14th Ministerial Conference of the World Trade Organization. I'd also like to thank you for highlighting the state of play at the WTO and the different positions that have been taken by different countries, different members of the WTO in terms of what they think or what they feel the WTO should do or should not do, and also for highlighting issues that Kenya should focus on as we prepare for the ministerial conference. Very important and very useful insights for us as we prepare for this conference. There are a number of issues that you highlighted, and of course, to contextualize this discussion, the WTO, in my view, is at its twilight, at a point where trade and trade policy has been politicized. Countries are now using trade to achieve political gains, and as such, the rules-based multilateral system is suffering. The issues that you've raised and the positions, I mean, the suggestions that you've made as to what Kenya should look out for, the special and differential treatment, issues of the moratorium on electronic transmission, the issues of MFN. These are issues that have been really at the negotiating table for some time. And the challenge now is not necessarily holding positions, but how do you get to advance your position as a country, as a group, or as a small member of the multilateral trading system. And in this case, by small, I mean in terms of our contribution to international trade. So I'd like to get your perspectives generally on these positions. Yes, we can take this position, but what would you advise in terms of strategies to ensure that our positions are sort of either form part of the decisions or influence the decisions? I'll be happy to hear your perspectives on particularly strategies and approaches to advance these positions at the MC14 and ahead. Thank you.
Moses?
Sure. Thanks. Well, thanks, Dennis, and well for being somebody who has represented us at WTO on different issues. We appreciate you for that service. Well, what can Kenya do to ensure that whatever they're advocating for, what strategy should we take? Like you rightly said, that WTO at some point is almost moving to very political discussion. And one of the things we feel is that it can be proven, and we did a part of that using data to show. And we also illustrated that some countries support some of the standard we think Kenya should take. And one of the things I think is Kenya should align with the issues they believe in, well, irrespective of what countries stands where. But in each platform, as we have shown, there are countries already urging reforms toward that direction. And we think Kenya should also draw in their voice. The other thing is Kenya being an influential member of ESC, and after, of course, we think Kenya can join voices with ministers from these different countries and ensure that we are able to have a massive voice, which is why we argue that Africa should actually fight for multilateralism because, well, first of all, using evidence, forget the politics that come up, and well, sometimes politics take the day, but emphasize on the use of evidence to encourage other people to see the perspective. Number two, align with countries that are already pushing for reforms within this mechanism. But more importantly, as Africa, as ESC, well, we can align by, and given Kenya is quite influential in this category, I don't know the reach they have when it comes to urging members toward reforms. But I feel that Kenya can take that as a strategy. Evidence, align with those already in this reform pipeline towards certain direction, and also use platforms like ESC and after to actually urge Africa to move toward certain direction. Thanks, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Moses. I will to what Moses has said. I will add that around the world we actually are seeing examples of what we talked about when we talked about courage. I think that Alexander Stubb, right, the leader of Finland, is a good example of courage in trying to defend the multilateral system we already have. And so if Kenya was able to engage at that intellectual level on the intellectual debate and defend the free trade component of the rules-based order and forward this support in terms of in principle. So, for example, how can this be practically achieved? So the Institute of Economic Affairs is an example of a civil society initiative to bring intellectual rigor to support positions that actually promote welfare of say citizens of Kenya and of the world, right? So institutions like the Institute of Economic Affairs across the world and even in within the advanced economies can be used as allies in that pursuit. So, for example, there's probably other think tanks in a country like Finland and even in the United States and across the world that can be allied with and say, look, this is the position we have. Do you have the same position at the intellect on the intellectual domain? Okay, let's ally with you. And then in terms of those practical matters of getting the voice out, I mean, we've seen that media, social media, and all these tools can actually um, uh, put a nation at the forefront of and help to shape the discourse because the influence and sort of the optimism that Alexander Stubb and even to an extent the Prime Minister of Canada have contributed to that debate should be ascertained. And I think the fact that many pundits, many analysts across the world are actually taking note of what they're saying and saying this is the mature way of engaging in global debates is notable. And so that's, I think, the direction that a country like Kenya should take. Start engaging on that. Take a well thought out intellectual position.
Any other question? We hope we answered you, Dennis. Feel free to also engage with us. We can also explore that further. Anybody else who has a question?
Yeah, as you think of your questions, here again, I'll just put up the quote so you can have a look. This is important because, you know, Francis Fukuyama in 1990 when he's been quoted again and again ad nauseum saying that history was over and people, I mean everyone from the leader of Germany, right, who just quoted him a few days ago saying that yes, Francis Fukuyama was wrong, history is not over, because history in this case was about countries going against liberalism. Liberalism is the word liberalism is about freeing things up, freeing people up. Classical liberal thought is the idea that when we look at everything in sum, number one, when the one of the most powerful ideas in economics is the equilibrium. At equilibrium, households and firms' welfare is maximized. So one of the contributors to that equilibrium are stable institutions and institutions that promote political and economic freedom. So Francis Fukuyama, one of the arguments that he was actually making in saying that history was over is that he was saying that human beings have experimented over thousands of years with all these different kind of institutional configurations. And the one institutional configuration that beat others out again and again was that was based on what is called you could say classical liberal institutions. So institutions that promoted optimum freedom politically and economically, that these institutions deliver the most welfare. So when we talk about the Cold War and say who won, Francis Fukuyama would say that the part of the world that was freest was wealthiest. And so if you're talking about security, right, which is what, for example, Merz was talking about when he said the end of history, it's that actually, if you want security, you want to be as wealthy as possible. And the wealthiest parts of the world are those that are freest. And we talked about this, and we have all our evidence, even here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and we're happy to help with that. That history, in that sense, is over. We know which kind of institutions produce freedom. Now the question is, are we courageous enough to build and support those kind of institutions? Or will we fall prey to what we call these zombie ideas from the past and actually condemn ourselves to poverty. And what happens with poverty? Even the weapons of defense and the institutions of defense that you want to pay for, you just find yourself with not enough money to pay for them. So, as we welcome again questions from the floor. Yeah, and I mean, and you're welcome to disagree. Very good. Okay, so here we have from Eric, very good presentation. However, I haven't heard if there's an analysis regarding the level playing field, which is being discussed at MC14. What should Kenya do, or was it covered under SDT? Okay, Moses?
I can't trace the question. Maybe have a go at it as I try to check that.
So, let's see. So, I haven't heard if there's an analysis regarding the level playing field, which is being discussed at MC14. What should Kenya do? Okay, maybe can you maybe clarify your question? I'm not sure what exactly you mean, Eric. And again, we are here to offer um, our services, even as the MC14 comes around and you think that there's a question that we can answer, we are very welcome to have you, just forward us a question, reach out to us through our contacts. Let me see if we have them here. Okay, let me
Well,
write. Yeah.
maybe as Eric tried to clarify the question, one of the things, Eric, you should understand that WTO is actually trying to create a level playing field for a country irrespective of your size or economic power. And that's why we feel that countries like ours who have too much to gain from WTO, and given that also we don't have powers like other countries have to struggle, other people to play within what what our interests are, WTO creates that. And the numbers we showed at the very beginning on how much trade has been able to happen since WTO came into play, how that interlinks to welfare and what that means to a typical Kenyan, shows you that evidence, data itself shows that there's enough benefit, and it's helping us in this case. And therefore, by supporting WTO and these necessary reforms that we think should be, and also emphasizing that WTO should focus on trade. And this is not an argument that all human rights, climate, investment are non-important. It's just an argument that WTO has a specific area and field of focus. We have other organizations under the UN or other places that deal with other issues, and they should take up those mandates. This is just answering to your question that we are advocating for a field where anybody can play irrespective of how big or small you are. And in case a dispute arises, you are able to negotiate without incurring too much cost than the benefit you probably have incurred if you didn't challenge those. And therefore, we feel WTO is a necessary organization. And by saying WTO is a necessary organization, we are talking about multilateralism, which we feel is the best alternative as far as international trade is concerned. I hope that gives you a bit of answer, Eric. Thanks.
And actually, as we continue, perhaps um, even questions on clarifications. Perhaps an aspect of the presentation was too complicated. We welcome those questions too. Yeah. Do you think that our perspectives were sufficient? You can also comment on that. Dennis, I invite you to take the floor.
Thank you again. Just to keep the discussion going, I mean, I'd like to pick on one of your recommendations on special and differential treatment and the proposal to support if I got it right, the differentiation. And if also I got you right, was the issue that Kenya should not be benefiting from the special and differential treatment. Of course, there's been debate as to the value of special and differential treatment for developing countries. And you may be aware that China has been fought by many members of the WTO to opt out of SNDT. And as a result of that fight, I think moving forward, China has indicated that they will not be availing themselves of the opportunity to use SNDT. They haven't done it formally, but in the subsequent discussions, they've made it clear that they have no need for SNDT. The position that has been taken by many developing countries, of course, SNDT is very useful to all LDCs, but also to some developing countries. And the position that has been taken is that SNDT is a treaty embedded right. And therefore, it should, even as members review the application of special differential treatment, they should keep in mind that the foundations of this treatment is treaty-based. So if that is the position, that is treaty-based, how do you then see this discussion falling? On one side, we have the developed countries taking the view that special and differential treatment should not be applied to all countries, which is true. But then how do you distinguish which countries should benefit from it and which ones should not if a member does not either opt out or insist? What are your views on that? How do you advance this discussion in terms of selecting beneficiaries and non-beneficiaries of SNDT from what it applies currently? Thank you.
Thanks. Moses?
Well, of course, WTO when forming SDT may not have foreseen a scenario where we have China benefiting a lot from it and refusing to exit it early enough. And therefore, it was almost formed on a goodwill perspective that a country will exit it once there is a feeling of we are able to follow the rules. Well, one of the things we urge here is, and this is why we actually encourage that we think they need MC14 need to clarify that. And what are some of the benchmark on who fits here and who doesn't? Should be used just economic terms. And one of these could be the share of a country in terms of global trade. A threshold can be established. Well, if you have more than 20% or so, like China has, and you still playing under this, we think that's unfair in all measures. But this will need the members to agree what threshold is big enough to get you out of that list. But also I think since that is not sufficiently enough, given that some countries might have a bigger share, but their welfare, the welfare of its citizens is still lower. Maybe we should also use welfare measures to ascertain whether that a country should be. But these need to be discussed. Well, we might not have clear thresholds that should be established as of now, but this is something I'm sure together with Emmanuel we sit down and maybe Dennis we can engage on this on the side. But specific threshold, especially on welfare, trade contribution and participation should be developed so that we don't depend on the goodwill of a country opting out, but WTO has a specific set of a list of thresholds, which upon being met, a country should exit. Well, of course, if a country want to exit before to meet this threshold, that's a welcome thing. But if a country is not willing to self-regulate and do that, then this threshold should apply. As far as I'm concerned, that should be the approach that we take in this case.
Yes. Thanks, Moses. I think, because SDT has been more voluntary, right? Whereas the determination of which countries are LDC, there's UN principles that determine that. So, I mean, one proposal, if let's say we had to come up with an idea right now to start with, maybe the knowledge intensity, right? Because if if an economy is advanced enough that you can see that and there's a tool out there that measures the knowledge intensity for at the level of research, at the level of technology, and the level of products actually produced. So you can tell with a pretty high level of robustness that a country, the country that is producing high quality research, so we can establish a threshold for the level of research, level of technology, and then the level of the of application of that technology, and then say, okay, at this threshold, a country should no longer qualify for SDT. But then at the same time, as I understand it, an important principle of the WTO has been that SDT is self-declarative. So South Africa, for example, I think South Africa and China are fervent defenders of that. That we should, because the WTO, the founding documents assert that a country determines for itself and self-declares. But even though a country self-declares now on the intellectual domain, we don't have to wait for a country to self-declare, but we can say, look, when we look at certain things, when we look at the level of because the knowledge intensity is also predictive of certain things, of it's indicative of current per capita incomes, predictive of future per capita incomes, and also predictive of many other human development indices. So a country that has a high level of knowledge intensity is also very likely to not have a high level of inequality, is likely to have a very high level of per capita incomes. Then at the level of debate, um, um, we can say intellectually, say, look, this such and such country like China, if it's producing, high tech outputs, high level research, should it really continue to benefit from SDT? Maybe not. But again, as Moses said, this is probably something we could sit down and discuss further. But that's where, that's one place we can start and say we don't have to wait for a country, even though a country can declare for itself, pressure can emerge on the intellectual domain and say that, you're kind of a grown-up country. Maybe you need to have more grown-up treatment. And this country is like a baby country. And so maybe not yet.
All right. So, well, we are way past our time frame, and given that we can see more questions, we will try and wrap it up at this point. So, as I give my concluding remarks, remember, we all want to prosper, but as has been proven, For that to happen, we need access to international markets. We also need access to international supply. We also are a small open country with limited bargaining power. And if we have to negotiate with everybody at a different platform, then what that means, the cost we will incur to our negotiation and bargaining will be so high, and we are likely to get bad deals since our bargaining power is limited. As far as that is concerned, Kenya, East Africa, Africa, and all other developing nations should draw their weight behind WTO, even as it faces pressure from the world, who is who, and those who wants to put the international trade in chaos, given that they have the leeway to do it, and of course they can meet the cost of that chaos. But also understanding that there are things that need to be reformed, there are changes that need to be taken, but given that there's also interference of politics, these reforms should be specifically stated, analyzed, and Kenya should have specific stance on different issues that will be brought on the table for reforms. And we thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you for being here with us. We shared our emails on the chat in case you'd want to advance this conversation. We also appreciate Dennis for the questions, and also Eric. Well, we understand that it will take both citizens, policymakers, and those who represent us in such space such as Dennis to ensure that we are moving towards prosperity. Once again, thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much. So small open economies can pursue unilateral liberalization of trade. Now, this doesn't mean that we are proposing that we should be cruel to those who are hurt by the process, but that actually we should look and case by case and find. So, for example, we have here at the Institute of Economic Affairs, we recently, in one of our previous webinars, explored the case of sugar and Kenya's sugar sector. And we can see the pain points, but we also can see where a country like Kenya and that a sector like sugar should have been exposed to more competition. So we lay out the principle here for unilateral free trade. We also lay out the principle for the defense of multilateralism and the specific reforms. And the probably one of the follow-up conversations is around the specific cases. Who needs what kind of help? We think that's a positive, pragmatic approach. Thank you very much for joining, and see you again another time.